Hello, I'm Bill Brackney, Director of the Acadia Center for Baptist and Anabaptist Studies at Acadia Divinity College and Acadia University in Wolfville, Nova Scotia. I welcome you to this taped version of the 2013 George Rawlyk Memorial Lectures. These lectures essentially bring us into close touch with critical questions in early Baptist and Anabaptist studies. Our lecturer this year is Nick Bunker, a specialist in 17th century Puritan, Pilgrim, and Separatist history in England. There are, for Baptist historians, two critical personalities that emerge from this period. The first is John Smith of Gainsborough, and the second is Thomas Helwys of Nottingham. In this first lecture, Mr. Bunker focuses on John Smythe, graduate of Cambridge University, a Puritan, Separatist, and eventually a Baptist thinker. Mr. Bunker focuses especially on the years of formation from John Smythe's time at Cambridge University until his emigration to Amsterdam, where he laid the groundwork for the Baptist movement, which was to be so important in the 17th century. In this first lecture, we will be introduced to John Smith the person, his origins, and the time he spent in the early Separatist community. I hope you enjoyed the lecture, and now we join Mr. Bunker. Our 2013 Rawlyk lecturer is Nick Bunker. Born in London and a graduate of King's College, Cambridge University, with a major in English literature, Nick has a master's degree also from Columbia University in New York in the areas of comparative literature and journalism. For 8 years, he worked as a newspaper reporter, chiefly with the Financial Times. In 1991, he left journalism to become an investment banker, firstly with the Dutch bank ABN AMRO, and then with the Hong Kong and Shanghai Banking Corporation. Since 2006, Nick and his wife Susan Temple, she is with us tonight, we are delighted to have her, have lived in the British cathedral city of Lincoln, a heartland for the early separatist and nonconformist of the 17th century, where Nick wrote his first book, Making Haste from Babylon, The Mayflower Pilgrims and Their World, published by Random House. He has long had a keen interest in the 17th century, the period of origins for numerous Baptist religious sects, numerous English religious sects, including the Baptists. He is currently completing a second book about the British colonial regime in North America in the 18th century. Besides history, Nick's interests include dogs, mountain walking, and architecture, and he is a member of two historical preservation societies, the Georgian Group and the Society for the Preservation of Ancient Buildings. For more than a decade, he served on the governing body of the Freud Museum in London, latterly as chairman. I might add, we learned tonight at dinner from Sue that in their basement they have a pillar that dates back to the year 1120. Mr. Bunker's work came to our attention in 2011 when Making Haste became must-reading in early Baptist studies. His work is, I believe, iconoclastic. He begins a new telling of the Pilgrim Fathers, not in England or in Leiden, but in wilderness Maine among beaver pelts. Readers of the Baptist heritage will be immediately taken with his rediscovery of John Smythe and Thomas Helwys, among others. Unlike earlier church and religious historians who have been confined to published and theological works, Nick has found entirely new ancient sources and references among public records, which he has thoroughly researched in context. Making Haste challenges many assumptions. It gets us right back into the thick of things, specifically along a river's edge in the spring of 1608. But more about that in the lectures. Nick Bunker's work is truly groundbreaking and destined to influence profoundly the course of Baptist studies. Nick, we are anxious to receive the results of your studies in your first lecture. an English Baptist in the age of Shakespeare. Let's give Mr. Bunker a round of applause.
Well, I'd like to begin by saying thank you to ACBAT, to the Divinity College, and of course to Acadia University for the very kind and I have to say very flattering invitation to me to give these lectures tonight and tomorrow evening. And I'm doubly grateful because my wife Sue is with me here. She's sitting in the audience, as Bill said, and we were able to have the opportunity this week not only for me to give the lectures, but also to have a brief holiday in Nova Scotia where we've been for the last week or so. And we've had a wonderful time. We've been canoeing, we've been whale watching, we've met several members of the Mi'kmaq First Nation. So altogether it's been a fascinating period, and especially for someone like myself who has taken so much interest in the early settlements by the English in New England, because here, of course, I've been able to visit the settlement at Port Royal and other sites connected with the French under Champlain. Now, tonight and tomorrow evening, I'm going to be talking about two men who can be fairly described as fascinating but also rather elusive. The two men being John Smythe, first of all a fellow of a Cambridge college, then a Puritan, then a separatist, then an English exile in the Netherlands, in the city of Amsterdam. A man born about 1570, we don't know exact date of his birth or indeed the exact place, died 1612. And then tomorrow evening I'll be talking about his slightly younger friend and contemporary, Thomas Helwys. Now, as I was saying, these two men are slightly elusive. And that's because there are many facts about them which we would like to know, but which we don't know. The documentation about Smythe is quite voluminous because he wrote prolifically. Most of his writings were actually published during his lifetime, either in England or in the Dutch Republic. And there's also a substantial body of documentary evidence about Smythe that survives in various archive collections in the United Kingdom, primarily in London, but also in Lincoln, where I happen to live. Helwys is much more difficult. With Helwys, the documentation is far less extensive and more difficult. He wrote published works, works of theology, but the details of his life are quite sketchy. And one of the things I tried to do in the course of my research, and which I'm going to discuss tomorrow evening, is the political and social background in particular to Helwys. So tonight's lecture will primarily deal with religious issues, with the religious career and the religious development of John Smythe, up to the point at which he left England in 1608 to go to Amsterdam. Tomorrow's lecture will deal far more with politics, and particularly with the politics of late Elizabethan and early Stuart England as it affected the area of the country from which Helwys came, that is to say, Nottinghamshire, which was a particularly interesting county. So, here we are, an English Baptist in the age of Shakespeare, John Smythe and the origins of separatism, 1590 to 1608. Now, when I began work on Making Haste from Babylon, I did not really intend to deal in enormous detail with John Smythe for a simple reason, which is that he never actually made it to America. The book was concerned with the early English settlements in New England, primarily the Plymouth colony, to a lesser extent the Massachusetts Bay colony up the road in Boston. Smythe never actually got there. But the more I examined the period, the more background reading I did, particularly concerned with Champlain and the French settlements, the more I became convinced that one of the primary issues that any historian of the exploration and settlement of North America has to come to terms with is the issue of morale. The difficulty for Champlain, not just for Champlain, but also for the settlers in Jamestown, Virginia, and of course the Plymouth colony in Massachusetts, was that of course they had to cope with an appalling problem of surviving a North American winter, a winter of a severity they had never experienced before. Particularly for the French, who in Champlain's case primarily came from the southwest of France, from the area around the port city of La Rochelle, an area which has a very mild climate indeed. So for them to be settling, trying to winter over, to remain over a winter in Nova Scotia or in New Brunswick or what is now the state of Maine, that presented great challenges. And one of the things, of course, Champlain recognized very early on, that it wasn't simply a question of logistics. It wasn't simply a question of being able to cope with scurvy or with dysentery and so on by having adequate supplies. There was the critical problem of morale. And Champlain was a very inventive man in terms of his attempts to deal with the problem of morale. You'll be aware, I'm sure, of the famous Theatre of Neptune, the amateur dramatics, which the French staged themselves at Port Royal. Also with the society they created, the Order of Good Cheer, which was intended to to maintain a spirit of conviviality during the winter. And I thought to myself, well, that was Champlain's solution. But in the case of the Plymouth colony in Massachusetts, in the case of the Mayflower Pilgrims, of course they had another source of morale, and of course it lay in their religious zeal and religious fervour. So I decided it was essential to understand as thoroughly as I could and convey to the readers of the book the nature of separatism and what it was all about. And that meant engaging with John Smythe. John Smythe, together with his friend John Robinson, who was the particular mentor of the Mayflower Pilgrims, was, to my mind, the most important writer in the separatist movement. He was also the clearest writer and the writer in whom we can see the development of separatist ideas most clearly. The question we need to get at, the question I wanted to get at, was what made this man become a separatist? What made him, having been a clergyman in the Church of England, what made him take the decisive step in 1606 or 1607, probably the latter year, of deciding to leave the Episcopalian Church of England and set up separate congregations because he found the church no longer tolerable? What was it? What was this all about? Where did this motivation come from? And so the first step along the road, of course, was to read John Smythe's works. And what I'm going to do is just talk about the very first, the opening. By way of introduction, I'm talking about the opening of the first book that he published. This is a book called The Bright Morning Star. It was published by the University printer at Cambridge in 1603. Smythe, as we'll see later, was very closely connected with Cambridge University. And it is not in any way an unorthodox book in terms of theology. It is what you might describe as mildly Puritan. It's not unorthodox. It is not by any means a separatist work. And this is the way it actually begins. You'll see it begins with a dedication to a man called Sir William Ray. And later on we'll talk a bit about Sir William Ray because he was quite a prominent, important figure in Lincolnshire, the county where Smythe did most of his work. And I'm just going to read this to you because you may not be able to see it. As I say, this is the opening paragraph of the dedicatory epistle of Bright Morning Star. The book, by the way, is a commentary on the 22nd Psalm, and again I'll come back to it a little bit later and explain why it's important. Sir, it seemeth a thing very reasonable to me, that seeing every bald tale, vain interlude, and pelting ballad hath the privilege of the press, the sermons and readings of ministers may challenge the same. The world is full of Guy of Warwick, William of Cloudsley, Scoggins, and Walner's jests, and writings of like quality. And therein men take great delight to read, and so make themselves merry with other men's sins, bestowing to this purpose much vain time and superfluous expenses. And I think the stationer's shop and some men's shelves are better furnished with such trifles, which deceive the mind and affection as the bait doth the fish, than with wholesome writings of nature, art, or religion. Now, there are a number of things that one immediately notices about this. And when I opened the book for the first time to begin reading it, I was very struck by certain features of the text. First thing is, it's actually quite nicely written. The man who wrote it, John Smythe, was clearly very concerned with literary style as well as theological import. He uses irony, he uses various rhetorical flourishes that are typical of the period. You'll see there's some alliteration, privilege of the press, and so forth. But the thing that is most striking about it, I suppose, is in the fourth and fifth line. It's this list of names: Guy of Warwick, William of Cloudsley, Scoggins, and Walner's jests. Now, you might ask why, in a serious work of religious intention, the writer should begin with this list of what seem to be, or what sound like, rather curiously outlandish, but obviously very vernacular references. I mean, who are Guy of Warwick, William of Cloudsley, Scoggins, and Walner? Now, Guy of Warwick's an easy one, and when I read it, I already knew who Guy of Warwick was. Guy of Warwick was a legendary or semi-legendary hero of English romances from the 13th and 14th centuries, roughly the same period as the early ballads of Robin Hood. Guy of Warwick was supposedly an English knight who travelled to the Holy Land, slayed various dragons, returned to England, and then finished his life as a hermit. And there is at Warwick, just below Warwick Castle, there is a place called Guy's Cliff, where allegedly he spent the last part of his life. So that was an easy one. William of Cloudsley, I had to go to reference books for. William of Cloudsley was an outlaw. He was a member of a band of outlaws whose other members were a chap called, principally a chap called Clym of the Clough, and they lived up on the Anglo-Scottish border, and they were similar. They were, if you might call, a sort of second division or second or third division version of Robin Hood, very much the same sort of environment. So what we're dealing with here is references to the popular vernacular ballads that were current in the 16th century. If you go to a catalogue of early English printed books dating from 1600, you will find that these names continue to recur. They were the heroes of the subjects of popular ballads, what was known as chapbooks, which were published for popular consumption. But the most curious of the names is Scoggins. Now, what on earth is Scoggins? Well, Scoggins is not quite as obscure as you might think, but I felt it was important to try and find out who Scoggins was, because clearly it mattered to John Smythe. And this is Scoggins. Scoggins' Jests. Scoggins' Jests was probably the most popular and widely read book of jokes in the late 16th century. It was a jest book. The first and best part of Scoggins' Jests, full of witty mirth and pleasant shifts done by him in France and other places. Now you'll notice that this is an edition from 1626. This is the first edition of Scoggins' Jests that actually survives intact. It's in the British Library in London. As is common with books of this kind, they tend to disintegrate because, of course, they're very widely read. And also, of course, being books of jokes, being comic books, they have a fairly short shelf life. After a few generations, they fall out of fashion and they simply vanish. So books like this are actually very rare indeed. Scoggins' Jests was, as I say, rare. It was an exceptionally popular book. Scoggin was allegedly a man who had been a jester at the court of Edward IV in the 15th century. And the book consists of a collection of whimsical and bawdy anecdotes told about Scoggin. It was collected in the 1540s by a man called Andrew Boord, who was first a monk and then a physician. He was a friend of Thomas Cromwell, so he was a figure on the fringe of politics. And the book actually contains quite a lot of what you might call popular anti-clericalism. A lot of the jokes are jokes directed at preachers, priests, nuns, and so forth. Now, why should John Smythe refer to something like this at the outset of a serious work of religion? And I think the answer is this, and this is crucial to the way I see John Smythe. He was a man embedded in the vernacular culture and the social history of his time. And the reason he refers to Scoggins' Jests and William of Cloudsley and Guy of Warwick and all these other characters is because he doesn't want simply to appeal to a learned ecclesiastical audience or an audience of academics such as himself, because of this, he had spent his early career as an academic at Cambridge University. Later on in this dedicatory epistle to the book, he says this. He says, "I have not varnished my writing with a superficial learning of words and figures, tongues and testimonies of men, which notwithstanding I do not disallow, but because I purpose to apply my style to the understanding of the simple. I endeavour to utter matter with all plainness of words and sentences." In other words, this is a man who sees himself as an evangelist. He wants to talk to and appeal to a wide audience, and to do so, therefore, in what he calls a plain style. Now, it has to be said that Smythe doesn't always achieve that, especially later in his career, where his writing became more and more difficult to follow. But early in his career, in this book and in the second book he published, he certainly did achieve it. He wrote very plainly and very clearly, so that his works are very easy to follow. Now, I think it's important that having told you all about Scoggins' Jests, I give you an example. Here's an example of Scoggins' Jests. I don't think it would be fair to tell you all about an Elizabethan joke without giving you an example. The humour, I have to say, can fairly be described as cruel. How Scoggin gave one a medicine to make him find his horse. There was a man that had lost his horse, and he came to Master Scoggin and said, "I hear say that you be a good physician, and I have lost my horse, and would fain know a remedy how I might find out my horse." Scoggin gave that man such a purgation that he was constrained to run to every bush and hedge, and peeking so about here and there, at last he found his horse. Then he reported that Scoggin was the best physician in the world. Now, it clearly made people laugh in the 16th century. And Scoggins' Jests, as I say, was an extremely famous book. It was referred to by Shakespeare as something which everyone would know about. "Jack Falstaff, now Sir John, I saw him break Scoggins' head at the court gate." Those are words spoken by Mr. Justice Shallow, the Justice of the Peace, the Country Justice of the Peace in Henry IV, Part 2, which was published first written and first performed in about 1598. So it was something which was very much part of the vernacular culture of the period, something that Shakespeare also would refer to. And what what this is telling us is that Smythe was a man who wanted to be a communicator, who wanted to communicate to a wide audience, who wanted to evangelize. And that really is the core of what I'll be talking about tonight, what it meant for Smythe to be an evangelist and why he felt in 1607 or 1608 that it was no longer possible to be a Christian evangelist within the Church of England as it existed. Now, as we go forward with John Smythe, there's a preliminary matter we have to deal with, which is this, about his reputation. Now, Smythe acquired during his life a reputation for being a volatile and mercurial character. He was thought of as being someone who was unpredictable, unreliable, someone with a rich imagination, but someone who strayed possibly beyond boundaries beyond which he should not have strayed. The kind of words that we use to describe Smythe were these. Now, William Bradford, the first governor of the Plymouth colony, one of the leaders of the Mayflower Pilgrims, referred to Smythe at length in an account of early separatism that he wrote in the 1640s. And he describes Smythe as an eminent man in his time and a good preacher, and of other good parts, but his inconstancy and unstable judgment, and being so soon carried away with things, did soon overthrow him. And this was a common view that was expressed about Smythe during his lifetime and after his death, and it came to be his reputation. John Cotton, another early English migrant to Massachusetts, one of the pastors, one of the earliest pastors of the new churches in Boston, referred to John Smythe's spirit of errors and instability. Another example comes from Uncle Robert Bailey. Robert Bailey was an English Presbyterian propagandist during the 1640s who took a very dim view of Smythe indeed. He described him as a man of an unsettled head. Now, these comments about Smythe have coloured subsequent views of him. He's come to be seen as someone who, although extremely important, everyone recognises that, was someone who was fickle, changeable, volatile, mercurial. Now, all of these actually seem to go back to a comment by his friend and colleague John Robinson, made in 1610, when John Robinson refers to Smythe's instability and want of wit. He says that his instability is his sin and our cross. So this is the reputation that Smythe has acquired. Now, what I'm going to argue is that although that reputation may be to some extent justified on the basis of the way Smythe developed after he left England in 1607 or 1608, it doesn't really apply at all to his earlier life. In fact, Smythe was a man who took a very long time indeed to make up his mind to leave the Church of England. It was a very long spiritual odyssey that he went through. And what I'll be doing today, this evening, is I'll be trying to chart the progress of John Smythe and to explain why it was that he got himself into that position. I see him as actually quite a practical man during the 1590s and the early 1600s. I see him as an evangelist who had been trained in the 1580s, primarily at Cambridge University, in a doctrine of what I call godly republicanism, in which he saw it as his duty, not only his duty, but the duty of his colleagues at Cambridge and in the Church of England, his duty to bring about the conversion of the nation, or the reconversion of the nation, so to speak. The nation had, of course, become Protestant officially in the 1530s, wavered back, of course, Catholicism under Mary Tudor, and then been re-Protestantized, so to speak, by Elizabeth I. But it was seen by men like John Smythe, men in the Puritan movement in Cambridge in the 1580s and 90s, as a nation still in need of further reformation, still in need of further purification and evangelization. So John Smythe was a man fundamentally strong as an evangelist. He was also a man preoccupied, as I see it, with the problem of the Christian life in the Anglican parish, in the parish as it existed in England in the 16th century, which is an institution, the parish, with certain peculiarities, particularly English, and with certain legal and social characteristics that are not those that we see today and are not necessarily seen in other churches. At first, Smythe, although always a Puritan, we might call a conforming Puritan. That is to say, he was happy to remain within the established Church of England. But gradually, due to a chain of events which I'll chart in the course of this lecture, he was forced into a species of almost internal exile. He was unable to obtain employment. He lost his license to preach. He tried to work as a school teacher, but he lost that job too. He tried to find employment as a physician, but physicians also required licenses from the authorities, and that license was available to him. And eventually, in 1607 or 1608, he separated from the Church of England, formed his own alternative congregation in the Nottinghamshire and Lincolnshire area, and eventually took refuge in the Netherlands. And what I'm going to do is trace the phases by which this occurred. Now, this is rather different from the way people normally talk about separatism. Normally, when historians, or conventionally when historians deal with the origins of separatism in England at this period, they tend to see it as like, if you like, a relay race, with a baton being passed from one separatist thinker to another. The first and the most famous being Robert Brown, who gave his name to the Brownists, which was the name given to separatists in England roughly from the 1580s through until about the time of the English Civil War in 1642. He's regarded as being the pioneering separatist. The baton then passes from Robert Brown to a man called Henry Barrow, active in the later 1580s and the early 1590s until his execution by Elizabeth I. Then it passes to a gentleman called Francis Johnson, who read the works of Brown and Barrow, was convinced by them, and created his own separatist congregations in Amsterdam in exile in the 1590s. And then it passes forwards to Smythe and to Helvis and to Robinson to a subsequent generation. Now, from a theological point of view, this progression that I've described is probably quite accurate, but it isn't actually what happened in practice. In reality, a man like John Smythe took a very long time to adopt the position of separatism. It was a very radical thing to do. It was a very hard decision for him to take. And the process by which he reached that position was not so much a theological one as a practical one. He simply found it impossible in the conditions that existed at the time, and in the changing circumstances early in the 17th century, he simply found it impossible gradually to remain in the church in which he'd been brought up. Now, there are going to be three dominant themes in which I'm going to be talking about, because these are, I think, the three dominant themes of Smythe's career. First one is faith. Now, Smythe came from a generation of English clergymen and theologians who were profoundly concerned with the definition of faith. From the very beginning, of course, the Reformation had been concerned and preoccupied with this question. The great founding text of the Reformation, of course, from the Epistle to the Romans by St. Paul, the just man shall live by faith. The doctrine of justification by faith, which was so central for Martin Luther, for Calvin, for all the Protestant reformers. By the time that John Smythe was receiving his education at Cambridge and becoming a clergyman, by that time, the question really was not whether justification occurred by faith, but what faith actually meant. What did it mean to be faithful in the England of the 1590s? How was faith acquired, and what were the implications of faith for the faithful Christian? What obligations did it impose upon him in terms of his daily life and in his attitude towards the society of his time? The second great preoccupation of John Smythe is the nature of prayer. John Smythe was fascinated by the book of Psalms. He continually refers to the book of Psalms. It was the subject of that first book, which I was discussing earlier. It's a subject to which he continually comes back throughout his life, throughout his career. And the reason, of course, he was so concerned about the Psalms was, of course, it is so deeply connected with the question of faith. The Psalms he saw as a model for the way prayer ought to be, the heartfelt utterance of the faithful, the fervent and heartful utterance of the faithful, and often the fervent and heartfelt utterance of a faithful soul in distress. The third dominant theme of his career was this concern with the English parish system. He was a man preoccupied by faith and with prayer, but he was also preoccupied with the circumstances in which faith occurred and in which prayer could be practiced. And here he became particularly preoccupied with another book of the Bible, which was the second epistle of St. Paul to the Corinthians. So those are the three dominant themes that are going to keep on coming back, and you might want to bear those in mind as we go through the lecture. Now, the phases of Smythe's career, there are basically four phases. Phase one is period at Cambridge from 1586 to 1598, first of all as an undergraduate, and then as an academic, as a fellow of his own college. There's a period between 1598 and 1600 where we don't really know very much about Smythe at all. We have no records at all to tell us what he was up to during that period, 2 years, between 1598 and 1600. Later on, I'll speculate a little bit, but it is a spot where we have very little information. Phase two was his period in the cathedral city of Lincoln, where he served as the town preacher. Phase three was his period in the wilderness. He lost his role as city lecturer and town preacher in Lincoln and was forced to spend several years desperately seeking to find another form of employment, but unable to do so. And phase four is the moment of separation, either late in 1606 or early in 1607. And I'll go through each of these phases in turn to explain what I think was going on in each one. Now, first of all, Cambridge. John Smythe went up to Cambridge in the March of 1586. Now, as I said, we don't know exactly where he was born or his date of birth. About 100 years ago, a Baptist scholar called Walter Burgess a Unitarian scholar called Walter Burgess developed a very interesting circumstantial argument to the effect that Smythe was born in a village in Nottinghamshire called Sturton-le-Steeple. The reason that's important is because that was also the home village of John Robinson, the spiritual mentor of the Mayflower Pilgrims. Now, it's quite a convincing case, and I think it may well be right, but the difficulty is that because John Smythe's name is so common, it's really very hard indeed to get a fix on his origins. There are simply too many alternative John Smiths that are available. So we can't be certain about it. What we do know, though, is that he entered Cambridge University in the March of 1586 as what they call a sizar of Christ's College. A sizar was a student from relatively humble origins who was admitted to university and who paid his way by acting as a servant to other students, particularly other students who might be members of the aristocracy. That was the usual procedure at the time. So young men from a yeoman family, from, say, the background of a yeoman farmer's family, which is probably the background from Smith Smythe came, could pay their way through their tuition at Cambridge by doing so. Although, of course, they would only be able to obtain that position as a sizar, only able to enter the university if they had a particularly good academic record, probably acquired at a grammar school, and also probably if they had some kind of patronage, either from a local aristocrat or from a senior high-ranking clergyman who they had impressed with their knowledge, almost certainly of Latin and Greek. That was the way you would get to be a sizar, is by having acquired a very good knowledge of Latin and Greek. So we entered Christ's College, Cambridge, 1586. And this is a very important moment in English history. It was the moment, of course, it was a moment of a profound crisis of national security. England was under enormous danger. It was under danger of invasion, of course, from Spain, the Spanish Armada, 1588. The Queen, there was a problem with the succession, of course. Mary, Queen of Scots, was the legitimate heir, or the most direct heir to the throne in succession to Queen Elizabeth. She was in captivity in the north of England, but if the Queen died, the Queen had no other obvious heir who could take the throne, and so there was always the great concern that if the Queen died, that Mary, Queen of Scots, would be supported by Spain, that she was supported by renegade English Catholics, and that she would return England to the Catholic Church. This was also the period when the cause of Protestantism in the Netherlands was under enormous threat from the Spanish. It was one of the low points for the Dutch in their long war against Spain, following the assassination in the Netherlands of William the Silent, or William of Orange. But it was also a period in which, although Protestantism was under great pressure and was felt to be under threat and in danger, it was also a period when Calvinism, in particular, was also very confident. This was a period in terms of its intellectual status. This was a point where Heidelberg, the University of Heidelberg in Germany, had emerged as a great centre of Calvinist thinking. In England, the Calvinists had captured, so to speak, the commanding heights of government and the universities. Calvinism, the doctrine of predestination, the ideas of John Calvin, were effectively the orthodoxy at Cambridge in this period. In addition to that, they were also supported strongly from some of the most powerful men in the kingdom, primarily Sir Francis Walsingham, the Secretary of State to Queen Elizabeth I, and also the Earl of Leicester, her favourite. William of Cecil, Lord Burleigh, the Lord Treasurer, who was her closest advisor, had some doubts about Calvinism, but although he had doubts about them, he was prepared to ally himself to a large extent with evangelical Calvinists within the Church of England, because he saw them as such staunch allies against the great enemy of the period, which of course was the Roman Catholic Church in Europe, and the fifth column of Roman Catholics still remaining in the United Kingdom. So this was the background against which John Smythe entered Cambridge. And he had a Christ's College. Now, Christ's College was a particularly interesting college. It had roots that went back to the medieval period. It had originated as what was called the Grammar College of God's House in 1437, but in effect it had been reinvented by the Tudors. It had been comprehensively re-endowed, first of all, by a lady called Lady Margaret Beaufort, who was the mother of Henry VII, and it had also then been re-endowed by Edward VI. And what had happened was that Christ's College had been awarded substantial amounts of property, so that by the time John Smythe entered it in 1586, it had an endowment fund consisting of about 45 manors or rectories, mainly distributed around the eastern half of England. It had a kind of a geographical hinterland, stretching from Essex northwards up into Lincolnshire and Yorkshire. And many of the students at the time, including Smythe, appear to have had links with that part of the country, essentially stretching northwards from Essex and Cambridge up towards Yorkshire, but with a heavy emphasis on Lincolnshire, Northamptonshire, what we call the East Midlands of Great Britain. It was also a college, it was a college therefore because of its endowment of land, much of which was former monastic land, which is, if you like, had a natural alliance with the cause of Protestantism. It was also a college that had an extremely distinguished intellectual reputation. At the time, some of the fellows of Cambridge, of Christ's College, Cambridge, were men of great distinction, great intellect, and in particular, they were innovators as well. Now, it was a small college. All Cambridge colleges were small at the time. About 20 or 25 students matriculated, by which I mean they entered the college each year. So the student body was probably only about 100 undergraduates, because most men would stay probably no more than about 3 or 4 or 5 years. And there were only 13 to 15 fellows at any one time. So it was a small place, an intimate place, and also it was a very young organization. One of the interesting phenomena about Cambridge University at the time was the youthfulness of most of the academics. The average age of the fellows of Cambridge colleges, that is to say the academics, the dons, was only about 30. And that was simply a function of the fact that the university had grown so rapidly. One of the things the Tudors had done was to encourage the decisive growth of Cambridge University, not least because they saw it as a source of training for clergymen. There was a widespread perception, which was pretty accurate, that the quality of clergymen in the Church of England was actually relatively poor. It wasn't as good as it should be. Now, there are a number of reasons for that, but it was essential to try and improve the standard, the academic standard of the clergymen in the Church of England, to train more of them and produce an educated clergy. And this is effectively the function of Oxford and Cambridge universities. And it remained the function of Oxford and Cambridge universities pretty much solely until the middle of the 19th century. Now, at Christ's, there were 2 or 3 men who were particularly important in the development of John Smythe. Now, one of them was a character called Francis Johnson, who I referred to earlier. Now, Francis Johnson was one of the pioneering separatists, and he acted as the tutor of John Smythe, at least for a period. Now, Johnson was effectively expelled from Cambridge University in 1589 because of his radicalism. What he had done was to give a series of sermons. I think it's actually one sermon, actually, but he gave a sermon in which he expressed what were regarded as heretical views. Essentially, Francis Johnson was a Presbyterian. He was an uncompromising Presbyterian. What that means is he wanted to do away with the episcopacy as of government in the Church of England and instead to have the whole of the church run by presbyteries, that is to say, collegial groups of clergymen, without any hierarchy of control from above. Now, this was a very radical position indeed to take in 1589, and Johnson fell foul of the authorities and was effectively expelled from university. Johnson, however, probably was not, in my opinion, a decisive influence on John Smythe. The reason I say that is simply because such a long gap passed between the date at which Johnson was expelled in 1589 and the first date at which we can find John Smythe himself expressing radical views. And even the views that he expressed then were far less radical than those of Johnson. So I think Johnson was probably not a decisive influence on John Smythe at this period, though later Smythe came back to read his work. The really critical influences on John Smythe were 2 other men. The first of whom is very famous, a man called William Perkins, who was probably the most distinguished Puritan theologian in England at the time. There is some debate among historians about whether you could actually call him a Puritan, but there's no question that he was probably the most widely read and effective theologian and also a very fine evangelist, which is a point I'll come back to in a moment. So he was the first influence. The second influence was a man called George Downham. George Downham, another fellow of Christ, another young man, only in his late 20s when John Smythe arrived. And John Downham was the one of the conduits which flowed into England the influence of a very important French thinker, Peter Ramus, or Pierre de la Ramée. And I'll come back and explain why that's important also in a moment. Now, William Perkins, as I say, was probably the most important, widely read theologian in England in this period, the 1580s and 1590s. He was a Calvinist, but he was a member of what you might call the third generation of Calvinists. He believed totally in the doctrine of predestination, that is to say, the notion that God has predestined humanity either to salvation or damnation from before the beginning of the world. That was something which he believed passionately. But it had ceased to be an issue about which he wanted to speculate because he believed it so firmly. Instead, Perkins is concerned throughout his career in the 1580s and 90s and until his death in 1602 with the practical implications of predestination. If we believe that all human beings are divided into two groups, the elect or the damned, and that God has predestined them to salvation or damnation from before their birth, from before the origins of the world, then what are the implications for the individual in daily life and in life in society? And Perkins attacked this issue from several different directions, but the most important were these. First of all, he argued that it was possible for individuals to become assured of salvation during their lifetime. This was a very important point, because if individuals could not be sure that they were saved, then in a sense, what motivation could they have to pursue an active Christian life? It had to be possible to reach an experience of assurance. And what Perkins did was to produce a theology or produce a body of work dedicated to analyzing the stages in the life of a human individual by which he could tell whether he or she was saved or damned or not. So he became, if you like, quite an acute psychologist. And he wrote works which contain a very sensitive examination of the stages in the human soul by which faith is acquired. He divided into a series of different stages. 4 primary stages. There was a moment of calling when you first became aware of the desire for salvation. There was a moment of justification, which was a moment when you began to feel the workings of God's grace inside the soul. There was a moment of sanctification, where salvation or assurance was actually achieved in this life. And there was a moment of glorification, which actually occurred at or after death, when the soul was actually transformed, when the soul was fully justified, when salvation was fully achieved. Now, what this meant for Perkins was an intense concern with analyzing the emotional life of the individual. And what Perkins pointed out in some of his most important writings was that faith is not a static process. Faith is not a static condition. Faith is a process which people achieve only over time. And doubt should be regarded as part of the process of achieving faith. In other words, if you feel doubtful, if you feel mortified, if you feel sinful, then those experiences of feelings of grief, torment, doubt, distress are part of the process of acquiring faith. So that although from one point of view the doctrine of predestination can be regarded as quite a fearsome, awesome doctrine, it was rather frightening, in the hands of someone like Perkins, there was available a technique by which people could become reconciled to it. Now, that was part of the appeal of William Perkins, and we can actually see it illustrated in the work of another man, a gentleman from Christ's, another member of Christ's College, a man called Samuel Ward, an undergraduate, who was another student alongside, it was a student of John Smythe, in fact, at least temporarily. And Samuel Ward left behind a manuscript diary, which is still preserved at Sydney Sussex College, Cambridge, in which he describes what it meant to be a soul in search of the experience of assurance. And these are diary entries from 1595. And Samuel Ward explains, he goes through his experiences of doubt, his experience of sinfulness, his experiences of inner torment. June 21st, 1595, he refers to my too much drinking after supper. June 22nd, 1595, he refers to my immoderate diet in eating cheese, very hurtful for my body at 3 o'clock. June 25th, 1595, he refers to my unfruitful spending of money that day I went down the river to Chesterton, which is a village near Cambridge. June 26th, my hard dealing with my tailor. June 27th, 1595, my going to drink wine and that in the tavern before I called upon God. July the 2nd, 1595, my not remembering of the poor this commencement. July the 4th, 1595, my slackness in going to prayer, also my pride of heart when I was teaching. I thank thee, Lord, for the good meditation I had later in the field. Now, this is characteristic of men at Cambridge at the time, of the kind of school of theology in which John Smythe was trained. That is to say, an intense concern with the inner workings of the soul in pursuit of salvation. So that was part of the tradition in which Smythe was educated. There was also another tradition in which he was educated, and that was the one I referred to earlier when I was talking about Peter Ramus. Now, Peter Ramus, or Pierre de la Ramée, was a French philosopher, born 1515, died 1572. He was one of the victims of the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre in Paris. He was a Huguenot. And in the first half and the second half of the 16th century, he became a figure of enormous intellectual prestige all over Europe, particularly at Cambridge in the 1580s and 1590s. Now, what Peter Ramus had done, Peter Ramus was quite a complicated character, and long books have been written about his work, but the essence of it is really this, or the essence of what people at Cambridge took from it. Peter Ramus was a logician. He argued that God was the perfect logician. Therefore, the study of logic was effectively one with the study of theology. But he had no time for the complicated logic of the medieval period, for much of the logic associated with Aristotle, which had been taught in medieval universities. He felt that it was too arcane, that it was too cumbersome, that it was irrelevant, it was too academic. And what Ramus tried to do was to create a new form of logic, which would be educational. He wanted to create a form of logic which would enable the students who had mastered it to take any aspect of human learning, any discipline, whether it be in the sciences, the arts, mathematics, or whatever, and rapidly mastering them. His argument was that it was possible to, using logic, to find a kind of universal method of analysis which could be used to understand any particular science. Now, it sounds rather abstract. Later on I'll explain exactly what it meant. But in essence, it's rather like a PowerPoint presentation of the kind that I'm showing to you here. He was one of the first people to argue that you could visualize arguments, that you could simplify a piece of discourse by dividing it up into key points and by using graphs and charts and diagrams. Ramus believed that that was the way by which you should try to master any discipline of thought, whether it be, as I say, the sciences, the arts, mathematics, and so forth. And he also was the way by which you could simplify theology. And Ramus did this partly because Ramus, as I say, was an educationalist. He wanted to find a method that would enable the rapid and efficient teaching of doctrine, science, whatever it might be, to a large number of students as rapidly as possible, far more rapidly and efficiently than had been achieved in the medieval period. Now, this became a source of great excitement at Cambridge, especially at Christ College. Ramist thinking started to enter England in the 1550s, but didn't really make very much headway. It was really the end of the 1560s and the 1570s that it first began to make an impact. And by the end of the 1570s, it was all the rage, particularly, as I say, at Christ College, and particularly with George Denham, who I mentioned. The first man who introduced him to Cambridge was a man called Lawrence Chatterton, who was another fellow of Christ's. And most of the men who introduced Ramist thinking into Cambridge were Puritans. That is to say, they were men who believed that the Church of England, as it had been established by Elizabeth I, required a substantial purification. It required a substantial re-evangelization. It required the exclusion of all sorts of Roman Catholic elements from the past that had crept into the church. And it also required a very firm stress on the evangelization of the laity. And they saw Ramist logic essentially as a way of helping with that, because it was a method and a technique that was designed to simplify and to provide rapid access to quite complicated bodies of doctrine. And that was one of the reasons why it became so important for them. And we'll see later how John Smythe tried to apply that himself. And already I think you can see here emerging two very clear themes. That John Smythe came from a generation who were preoccupied with evangelism, and they were also preoccupied with the life of faith. Understanding what faith actually means in a community of the kind that exists in Elizabethan England. So those were John Smythe's influences. Now, in terms of his early career at Christ's, the first time at which he actually becomes visible as a nonconformist, as somebody who might get into trouble with the authorities, comes in 1597, and it was this. Now, in the Cambridge University archives, there is preserved something called the Guard Book. Now, the Guard Book is simply a book that consists of the records of disciplinary proceedings by the university against students or academics who might have been guilty of some kind of infraction of the rules of whatever kind. And in the Guard Book for 1597, we find an entry referring to John Smythe. And the full entry reads something like this. It refers to John Smythe, fellow of Christ's, upon the 15th day of December 1597, contrary to the form of church discipline now established, delivered the words following: the surplice, the cross, the churching of women, and burial with prayer and such like cannot be warranted by the word of God, the most of them, or very hardly. Now, what this refers to is a set of very commonplace Puritan ideas about the failings of the Church of England. It had been commonplace for many, many years, back to the 1560s, for Puritan clergymen or Puritan laity in England to argue that there were certain aspects of the liturgy of the Church of England, as it had been established by Elizabeth I, which were unjustified by Scripture. For example, in the surplice, the wearing of a white linen robe by the minister during an act of worship. They argue that that was something that was not actually warranted by Scripture. The use of the sign of the cross in baptism, again, they argued that was something that was unwarranted. The churching of women, what that referred to was a practice that is still in the liturgy of the Church of England, whereby after giving birth, women go to church to give thanks. And burial with prayer, that is to say, the saying of prayers over the deceased, that was also something which Puritans argued was unwarranted by Scripture. So this is what John Smythe was accused of saying in 1597. Now, to be perfectly frank, these were not terribly radical things to say. They were commonplace. Many Puritans said this kind of thing, and they often really didn't get into trouble about them. The wearing of the surplice, for example. Now, in fact, there was one other Cambridge college at the time, Emmanuel College, Cambridge, where the surplice was almost never worn by the ministers who presided over acts of worship in the chapel, and yet nobody got into trouble about it. So these comments that John Smythe was making, although technically speaking they were nonconformist, they weren't actually terribly radical. The important thing about this, and the important thing about Smythe's development and the circumstances in which he left Cambridge, was the people who accused him of saying it. What had happened was that within Christ's College, a group of men had emerged who determined to end the college's reputation for Puritanism. They wanted to end the dominance of Puritans in the college's affairs. The three men who accused John Smythe of having made these statements and who reported him to the authorities were a man called Richard Clarke, a man called Martin Day, and a man called Valentine Carey. Clarke was a lecturer in Hebrew, and he actually became one of the translators of the authorized version of the Bible, the King James Bible. Martin Day was later chaplain to James I. And so you can see a pattern emerging there, which is that the people who reported John Smythe nonconformity in 1597, who denounced him as a Puritan, were in effect men who would later go on to become, under King James I, stalwarts of the Orthodox Jacobean Church. The third man who levied an accusation, who reported him to the authorities, was a man called Valentine Carey, who was even more significant in that respect. Valentine Carey was a relatively new fellow of Christ's College, who had been imposed upon the college after a contested election. If normally fellows of Cambridge colleges were appointed by acclamation by their colleagues, so to speak, there was not usually a vote, there was not usually a contested election, but occasionally it happened, and it happened in the case of Valentine Carey. He was effectively the anti-Puritan candidate, and after a lot of ructions, he was forced upon Christ's colleges by intervention from above by the Archbishop of Canterbury. And Valentine Carey went on in due course to become a very distinguished clergyman indeed. He became master of Christ's College from 1609 to 1622, where he distinguished himself by being an expert fundraiser. And what he actually did was transform Christ's from a relatively poor college to a very wealthy college, which remained throughout the 17th century. He was that kind of an academic. I mean, he was an exceptionally good fundraiser. He became Dean of St. Paul's Cathedral in London, which then and now is one of the most prestigious posts in the Church of England. He became Bishop of Exeter. He became, in other words, a prince of the Jacobean Church, very close to James I and very trusted by James I. Now, what had happened was this. What John Smythe was falling foul of was a kind of a changing of the guard that was going on in the Church of England. In the 1570s, 1580s, early 1590s, the upper ranks of the Church of England was still dominated by bishops in particular, who remembered the great heroic days of the middle 16th century, when Protestantism was fighting for its life against Catholicism. They remembered the period of Mary Tudor, when, of course, Protestant heretics were actually burned at Smithfield. Many of the bishops of the Church of England had themselves, in fact, been exiles who had been forced to flee to Europe during the reign of Mary Tudor. And so the bishops of the 1570s, 1580s, early 1590s were men who, although they weren't necessarily Puritans themselves, in fact they weren't, they were certainly sympathetic to Puritan views, they were evangelicals, and they were not men inclined to stamp down too hard against Protestant nonconformity. Now, Roman Catholicism is another very different matter. There, of course, they were very vigilant against Catholicism. But generally speaking, they were tolerant about other forms of nonconformity. Now, this began to change from the middle of the 1590s onwards. And what John Smythe began to fall foul of was precisely this change in the atmosphere. The emergence of a generally more authoritarian form of clergymen in the higher ranks of the Church of England. The most famous and the most important of these was a man we'll come to later called Richard Bancroft, who was really the nemesis of John Smythe. But this was the situation. Smythe, therefore, was a man who had been educated as an evangelical, committed to conversion, to preaching, fascinated and preoccupied by the problems of the development of faith and salvation of the individual soul, and also a man like George Downham and his other colleagues, heavily influenced by Peter Ramus, and therefore very much preoccupied with seeking to communicate theology, doctrine, Calvinist belief to a very wide audience. So that's the kind of man Smythe was. But in 1597, 1598, he begins to find himself falling foul of the authorities at Cambridge, because, as I say, this changing of the guard by way of a new authoritarianism. Now, at that point, Smythe decided to leave Christ. Now, it's not clear why he did that. Sometimes fellows would leave a Cambridge college simply because they wanted to get married. That's what happened with William Perkins. You could not be a Cambridge college fellow and be a married man. You had to give up your fellowship if you wished to marry. Sometimes that was the situation. Doesn't seem to have been the case with John Smythe, because he doesn't appear to have married until sometime later, about 1604, 1605. Sometimes men left a Cambridge college because they were expelled for whatever reason. Not necessarily because they were religious radicals like Francis Johnson, because of some other infraction. But there's no record at all that Smythe was expelled. If he had been, it would have appeared in the college records, which it doesn't. Usually they left simply to obtain what they call preferment in the Church of England, to obtain some lucrative parsonage, to become a rector or a vicar at some important parish. If they were coming from a college like Christ, that was what they would tend normally to do. And sometimes there was another opportunity open to them, which was to become what was called a town preacher or a town lecturer in some borough in England which had a particularly evangelical fraternity of men running its affairs. And this was what happened with... There we go, right. And this is what happened to a colleague of John Smythe, a colleague called Thomas Newhouse. This man was probably John Smythe's closest friend at Christ. He entered the college at exactly the same time in the spring of 1586. He became a fellow immediately before John Smythe, so he ranked just one notch ahead of him in terms of seniority. And as far as we can see from the available evidence, the two men were close. Thomas Newhouse also became a kind of a patron or mentor for John Robinson, who I referred to earlier, who was the pastor of the Pilgrims, the people who would later become the Mayflower Pilgrims. He actually employed John Robinson as his assistant. Now, what Thomas Newhouse did was this. Thomas Newhouse went to Norwich, where he became town preacher in 1602. Now, this was an excellent post. It was exactly the kind of post that a man like Newhouse or a man like Smythe wanted to achieve, because it was a post entirely devoted to evangelical work in a town where the magistrates, the local politicians, the local justices, were extremely sympathetic. Norwich was one of the best places you could go to pursue such a vocation. Norwich had a population of about 20,000, which meant that it probably ranked in the top 4 or 5 towns in England in terms of size. It was quite a prosperous place, very prosperous place in fact. Wealth and poverty existed side by side. It was very unequal, but nevertheless it was one of the wealthiest towns in England. In particular because it's very strong on the textile trade. It also had a history of openness to new ideas in terms of religion, partly because perhaps as many as a quarter of the people who lived in Norwich were immigrants from the Netherlands, from Belgium, from Flanders, people who had fled to England to escape religious persecution during the various wars of religion of the 16th century. So it had a very strong element of what were known as Walloons, it had Huguenots, it had all sorts of people from different parts of Northern Europe who had gone into religious exile and who worked in the textile trade. And also it had a very strong city government. I say very strong, what I mean is essentially very exclusive. There were essentially 12 families of merchants in Norwich who ran the whole town. They ran its affairs and they always dominated city government. They became a self-perpetuating oligarchy, which was something that was very characteristic of England at the time and remained true of England, in local government in England right through until the 19th century, and indeed in some cases beyond that. So Newhouse pursued this vocation at Norwich, and people regarded Norwich as very much a model for the way that a godly community ought to function. It was the kind of place where, by virtue of preaching, evangelism, by virtue of regulation of the poor, because the poor in Norwich were made to work, they weren't simply given poor relief, they were made to work, by virtue of strict enforcement of all kinds of moral codes and so forth, the town had become a kind of a model of what a godly community was supposed to be. And there's a description of Norwich, for example, which survives from a man called Sir John Harrington, who visited the city early in the 17th century when Newhouse was preacher. And he describes Norwich, he says, "Concerning Norwich, whether it be to the praise of the bishops or the people or both, I know not, or whether I have heard a partial relation, I have heard I should judge this city to be another utopia. The people live all so orderly, the streets kept so cleanly, the tradesmen young and old so industrious, the better sort so provident, and withal so charitable, that it is rare to meet a beggar there, it is common to see them in Westminster." Now, I think he exaggerated, because actually we do have Mother Evidence, there were lots of beggars in Norwich. However, that's the reputation Norwich had. And Norwich was the ideal location. A town like Norwich was the ideal location for someone like Newhouse or someone like Smythe. Newhouse's job as town preacher was to give 2 sermons a week at the church of St Andrew's, Norwich, for which he was paid quite a handsome stipend by the city authorities. This was an ideal post. There were other places in England which were similar. Norwich was one. Hull was another example, the seaport of Hull. There were others. I think Bristol was a good example. And there were various others scattered around the country. These boroughs controlled by an oligarchy of local magistrates, Puritan by implication, heavily evangelical, and who saw to some extent the preaching of the word as being a reinforcement of their techniques of social control and social discipline. So that was Norwich. Norwich would have been ideal, but the trouble was that John Smythe, although he tried to pursue the same option, the same kind of option, found himself in a very different location, and that was Lincoln. Now, as I shall explain later on, Lincoln was not the same thing as Norwich by any means, but it might have appeared that way. The city of Lincoln, originally a medieval cathedral city, had to some extent by the early 17th century fallen into decline. Nevertheless, it had certain advantages for a man like John Smythe. There was a local network of Puritan landowners. Right at the beginning of this lecture, I talked about a man called Sir William Ray. He was the subject of the dedication of Smythe's first book, The Bright Morning Star. Ray was a member of a family of landowning gentry in the Lincolnshire area, mainly based about 10 miles north of Lincolnshire, who had formed a kind of a network of Puritan sympathizing squires. They were large landowners, they were politically influential. Christopher Ray, the most distinguished member of the dynasty, was actually the Lord Chief Justice. He was the man who presided at the trial of Mary Queen of Scots. His son, William Ray, to whom John Smythe dedicated the book, was a member of Parliament. William Ray had 2 sisters, Isabel and Frances Ray, both of whom also married wealthy gentlemen with landowners with Puritan sympathies. So the whole family were Puritan sympathizers, and they formed part of a network all across the region who protected and sympathized and allied themselves with men such as John Smythe. Also within Lincoln, there was a godly party in the town government. There was a group of men, principally a man called Robert Risworth and Edward Dennis, both of whom served as mayor, and both of whom had a long history going back 20 years or so, in which they had tried to institute a form of government in the town which they felt would achieve moral reformation, which would encourage the teaching of the Word of God. In other words, which would turn Lincoln into a godly community rather like Norwich. And finally, the local clergymen were actually quite sympathetic to a man like John Smythe. The bishop William Chatterton was by now a man of about 70, but he was precisely a member of that earlier generation of bishops of the Church of England, Elizabethan England, who were evangelical, firmly anti-Catholic, and who were prepared to turn a blind eye to Protestant nonconformity. The same seems to have been true of Lincoln Cathedral. The cathedral clergy at Lincoln also appeared to have been relatively sympathetic towards Smythe. At any rate, they turned a blind eye when he himself became accused of nonconformity. So Lincoln had various attractions to him. And what Smythe did in Lincoln was that he preached a series of sermons. He preached a series of sermons, two series of sermons, in fact, in which he developed his thinking about prayer, about faith, and about salvation, and about his own evangelical mission. Now, his job as town preacher was to give 2 sermons a week. He would give 1 sermon on a Sunday afternoon and 1 sermon on Wednesday morning. He would do that at a church called St. Peter at Arches, which is right in the centre of Lincoln, only about 50 yards from the Guildhall where the town government was based. He was appointed to the post of town preacher at Lincoln in September 1600 at a salary of £40 a year. He was given £3 6 shillings and 8pence for the rent for his house, and he was given the right to graze 3 cows on the South Common, which was the town's municipal pasture land. And that was important because that was about 4 times as much as he would have received as a fellow of a Cambridge college. It was a handsome stipend by the circumstances of the period. And he was chosen and nominated for this post as town preacher by the 2 men I mentioned earlier, Rishworth and Dennis. But there was a contested election. There had to be an election to decide who would be chosen as preacher. Although he was nominated by these men, there was a tie. The aldermen of the town voted. There were 14 of them, and there was a tied vote. They voted 7 for Smythe and 7 for somebody else, and only by the casting vote of the mayor was Smythe actually named as the town preacher. So therefore, from the very beginning, there was a potential problem there. Now, what Smythe did in Lincoln was, as I said, he developed his preaching mission. He did it really in two different ways. First of all, he did it by using the techniques of Ramist logic that I referred to earlier. And what he did was this is the way he would preach. He would take a psalm, let's say Psalm 22, and he would work his way through it, trying to extract every little tissue of meaning from the psalm. This is exactly the technique that Peter Ramus, the French philosopher, had done. You would say, well, the prayer which the prophet prophesied he made to the Lord, the prayer was fervent, the prayer was continual. He had then to analyze what he meant by fervent. Fervency includes faith, it includes desire. And he would work his way through the psalm in great detail, trying to analyze every little aspect of meaning and drawing out for the benefit of the listener. Now, it's hard to know exactly what the good people of Lincoln made of this, but from his point of view, it was essential because it was a technique of evangelization intended to draw the reader right into the heart of the Word of God. And he particularly fastened upon Psalm 22 because this is a particularly interesting psalm. It is, of course, the psalm that begins, my God, why hast thou forsaken me?" And what Smythe was trying to do was to argue that the Psalms were the place in the Bible where you saw most clearly the fervent utterance of the distressed soul in pursuit of salvation. His argument was that David, in writing this psalm, was not only conveying his own situation, his own sense of despair, his own sense of rejection, his sense of exile, but was also foreshadowing the passion of Christ on the cross, and was also presenting a kind of an allegory or a symbolic representation of the condition of every single human soul. And that's why it became so important with John Smythe. He was fascinated by the Psalms for this reason, because they seemed to him to be a model of prayer and a model for the prayer as the fervent utterance, as I say, of the distressed soul in search of salvation. So that's what he did. Now, and these were the basis, and this book, The Bright Morning Star, was based essentially, consists of an expanded version of a set of 4 sermons that he gave in Lincoln in sometime between 1600 and 1602. Right. Now, the problem was that although Lincoln had some superficial similarities to a place like Norwich, it actually wasn't really very like it at all. First of all, Lincoln was relatively small. Norwich population about 20,000, Lincoln about 2,000. It was a small place. It was in economic decline. It hadn't developed a textile industry like Norwich. It was also beset by political strife, particularly because of the activities of a man called John Beck and a man called Leonard Hollingsworth. They were the rivals of Rishworth and Dennis. And they appear to have been, now it's not entirely clear what their motivation was or what their origins were, but both men appear to have been involved in the brewing trade. And certainly this is what their opponents accused them of. They were accused of being men who were primarily, who were ungodly, brewers, men who were inclined to encourage alehouse tippling, men who were gamblers and so on and so forth. Now probably this was exaggerated by their opponents, but it's quite clear that Beck and Hollingsworth saw themselves as very much the anti-Puritan party in the town. And so, given that Smythe's election had been contested anyway, it had been disputed, you can see clearly that he was in potentially a dangerous situation. Against this background, he gave a second set of sermons. The second set of sermons he gave The second 30 sermons he gave were called A Pattern of True Prayer, and that's the title under which they were eventually published. And these dealt with the Lord's Prayer. He moved on from the Psalms to the Lord's Prayer. And what he did was to trespass into very dangerous territory from a theological and spiritual point, religious point of view. There had been a long argument in the Church of England about the value and the role of the Lord's Prayer. There was a conservative element in the Church of England which believed that the Lord's Prayer was an essential part of worship which should be repeated at every single occasion. Morning prayer, evening prayer, Holy Communion, during the marriage service, funeral services, it was absolutely essential. There was another wing within the Church of England which took the view that this was something which was dangerous because the continual repetition, they argued, this was the Puritan view, continual repetition of a form of words was simply encouraged lax observance of religion. Continued to be repeating a form of words which the speaker had not familiarized himself with, the speaker did not fully understand. They regarded as being something which was effectively a throwback to the old Roman Catholic tradition. And they were very unhappy about this. What Smythe did in these sermons, unfortunately, was to ally himself with the most radical of critics of the Lord's Prayer. That is to say, with those who believe that the Lord's Prayer should be relegated to a relatively minor role within the liturgy, and instead that individuals should use what he called conceived prayer. That is to say, they should develop their own prayers based possibly on the model of the Lord's Prayer, but with considerably more by way of improvisation. Now, this is a dangerous position to take because in the church that was developing at that time, the new authoritarianism of some of the people I referred to earlier, of the new bishops, particularly Bishop Bancroft, who was the Bishop of London, specifically objected to the kind of thing that Smythe was saying. Smythe had also apparently fallen foul of the Beck and Hollingsworth faction. It's not entirely clear why, but they took a very dim view of John Smythe. And they did what they could to try and obstruct his preaching. For example, towards the end of 1602, they actually attempted to prevent him from entering the pulpit at St. Peter and Arches. They kept him out of the pulpit. They disrupted his preaching, and they reported him to the authorities for what they called erroneous doctrine. Worse still, towards the end of 1602, the Beck and Hollingsworth faction actually managed to eject Smith entirely. What they did was they won the city election in the autumn of 1602. They fired Smythe as preacher. They had superseded Dennis and Rishworth in the Puritan faction, and Smythe was deprived of his preaching license. He was first fired as town preacher, and then, given that the Beck and Hollingsworth had reported him to the authorities, he was then deprived of his license by the Bishop of Lincoln. A complicated little process followed, lasting about 6 months or so, during which Smythe won his license back briefly, or so it appears, and then had it taken away again. Now, it's not entirely clear what Smythe had done to upset the Archbishop of Canterbury, but it is clear that by the spring of 1603, Smythe had become a marked man. Now, various attempts were made to rehabilitate him by his friends, some of whom were quite powerful. Dennis and Rishworth, his advocates in Lincoln, were relatively wealthy men. They petitioned James I. They also mounted a case in the Court of Star Chamber in London in support of Smythe, and accusing Beck and Hollingsworth of essentially disorderly conduct and causing and disturbing to public order. So he had various powerful friends, but the difficulty was that he was entering a period now in which powerful friends could not really help him. What the problem for John Smythe was that he had essentially timed his interventions rather badly. He emerged as the pattern of true prayer. His commentary on the Lord's Prayer became current at precisely the time when the new authorities and terrorism in the Church of England was becoming most extreme. And this was due to the emergence of Richard Bancroft as the Archbishop of Canterbury. Now, Richard Bancroft was the Bishop of London. He was an extremely diligent and effective administrator. He was also a man who was determined to enforce discipline not only within the Church of England, but also within the laity itself. And so any form of nonconformity he wished to eradicate. And as such, he became extremely close to James I early in his reign. James I became king early in 1603. And James I was determined in the early years of his reign effectively to try and establish uniform systems of government all the way across his three kingdoms, England, Scotland and Ireland, and particularly within religious observance. And Bancroft appeals to him as a man who was an excellent instrument for achieving precisely that end. Bancroft was a very diligent man, as I say, and extremely conscientious, and also by nature authoritarian. Exactly what Bancroft's own theological views were is not entirely clear, because he didn't tend to deal in theology. He was essentially an administrator. But in the course of 1603, 1606, 1605, Bancroft emerged as the decisive figure in the church. He was confirmed as Archbishop of Canterbury in December 1604. Now, by that time, Bancroft had taken the critical step, which was to lead to the Act of Separation by John Smythe and his fellow separatists in 1607 to 1608. And that was the development of what were called the Bancroft Canons. Now, this is a very important, this was a very important development indeed. The Bancroft Canons were a set of regulations of the Church of England. The Church of England at the time had inherited a huge array of different regulations, laws, instructions, rules, codes of conduct, some of which dated from the Middle Ages, many of which dated, however, from all the legislation that had been passed by Henry VIII and by Elizabeth I to regulate the church and turn it into a Protestant church. It was all very confusing. Some of these regulations related to theology, some of them related to matters of the most basic and mundane kind, such as the regulation of church buildings, the design of church buildings, the responsibility for maintaining church buildings. There was a whole massive array of regulations. Bancroft's job was to turn the whole thing into a new streamlined codified system, which was fully acceptable to the king, which established a uniform disciplined code of conduct and set of regulations all the way across the church, and which, crucially, was adequately enforced. The problem with the previous canons from Bancroft's and the king's point of view was that they had been enforced rather loosely. These were designed to be cast iron boilerplate. And the Bancroft canons were 141 of them. 141 altogether. They were very repetitive, actually. They were put together in a hurry because Bancroft was told to get on with the job rapidly, and he drafted them in the course with various colleagues in the course of about 6 weeks. And they came into force in England, in the southern half of England, in the Archbishop, within the authority of the Archbishop of Canterbury in the autumn of 1604. They came into force later, much later than that, in the Diocese of York, in the Archdiocese of York, and that's something that's quite important, which I'll refer to in a moment. So 141 canons. The difficulty with these canons was that they represented a huge challenge for men such as John Smythe. In the past, in effect, there had been lots of places to which a Protestant nonconformist could go if he felt unhappy with the way the church was run. If he was a Cambridge fellow, such as John Smythe, he could seek a town lectureship. If he couldn't obtain a town lectureship, he could probably obtain a post as a curate or a vicar in a parish where the local choice of the vicar was dominated by a local Puritan landowner such as William Ray. Sometimes he could find a post as a chaplain in a landed gentry family of Puritan inclination. Sometimes he could find a post as a school teacher. He could even, in some circumstances, find a post as a physician which was a post that was often taken on by clergymen looking for some extra form of employment, although the role of physician was actually regulated also, as I said earlier, by the church. The Bancroft Canons were intended basically to seal up all the various loopholes and to create a situation in which there was really nowhere where a nonconformist could go, and that's exactly what was done. Now, Smythe, as we saw, had lost his position as town preacher in Lincoln, so what could he do? Well, he tried to obtain a post as a school teacher, but he did obtain a post as a school teacher in a village called North Clifton. I'll just say where that is, roughly. North Clifton is roughly down here, just inside Nottinghamshire. That's North Clifton, roughly there. He obtained a post there as a school teacher. That seems to have come about because he had some sympathies in the cathedral at Lincoln, because North Clifton was a village where the local parish church was under control of the dean and chapter of Lincoln Cathedral. So they appear to have given him that post. But somehow he lost that job too. Again, being a school teacher required a license, so presumably what happened was that the license was withdrawn because he disappeared from North Clifton. He tried to work as a physician. Again, license removed. He then moved to the town of Gainsborough. Now, Gainsborough was a town about 15 miles northwest of Lincoln on the River Trent. Gainsborough, I'll just show you where it is on the map. You'll see it's just about up there. Gainsborough was an attractive place to go to work or to live because Gainsborough was very close to the Rays, the landowners I mentioned earlier on, and because Gainsborough had a number of gentlemen, landed gentlemen, leading luminaries in the town, who were either Puritans or Puritan sympathizers, or at any rate prepared to welcome someone like John Smythe. And John Smythe received quite a good welcome in Gainsborough. The difficulty was that John Smythe could not stop preaching. And in towards the end of 1605, he accepted an invitation at Gainsborough to give a series of sermons, or to give a sermon or a series of sermons, while the incumbent minister of the parish church was away, a man called Jerome Phillips. He accepted an invitation to give some sermons. And of course he chose the Psalms. Of course he chose the Psalms. Now, of course, this was technically illegal because his preaching license had been revoked. He could not preach in a church. It was simply illegal. It had always been illegal, actually, but it had become even more illegal, so to speak, after the Bancroft Canons. And the reason for that was because what the Bancroft Canons had done was to say, not only is it illegal for someone without a preaching license to preach in a church, but it is the duty of the church wardens and any other officers in the church who come to hear about it to report that infraction to the bishop so that action can be taken. Now, that was something new. Effectively, by making the church wardens responsible directly for reporting such activities to the authorities, it was effectively closing up a great loophole. It meant that a man with a preaching license really had no chance at all of being able to preach. The church wardens would not dare in future not to report him for doing so because, of course, they themselves could be liable to prosecution. They could, in extreme circumstances, actually be liable to imprisonment. That would have required the involvement of the secular authorities, the local justice of the peace, but it still could happen. So Gainsborough, he falls foul of the authorities. Now, even then, John Smythe did not become a separatist at that moment. He was still within the Church of England, still trying to maintain his role within the Church of England. Still not yet a separatist, even though we're talking now about 1606, which is 9 years after the first time at Cambridge he had been reported for nonconformity. But his situation was becoming impossible. Now, Gainsborough, as I say, was a place where John Smythe enjoyed a certain amount of support from the local gentry squirearchy. And indeed, they wrote letters to the Bishop of Lincoln defending John Smythe after he was reported for preaching without a license. Didn't do any good, of course. Smythe still had no preaching license. He had been deprived of his post he'd been deprived of his ability to earn a living as a physician. He couldn't work as a school teacher. Long since lost any possibility of being able to obtain any kind of living as a vicar or rector in the Church of England. And of course, many years now had elapsed since he had left his post as a Cambridge Don. So he was a man effectively without a livelihood by this stage. Even so, even then, in 1606, when he was surrounded on all sides by what he saw as persecution, which indeed he was, even then he did not actually become a separatist yet. He attended an important meeting in the town of Coventry at some time in the spring of summer in 1606. Now, Coventry was important because Coventry was the home of an important Puritan divine, a Puritan clergyman within the Church of England called Humphrey Fenn, who specialised in attempting to dissuade men in Smythe's position from actually leaving the church. This was often his role. And this appears to be what he did in Coventry in 1606. Smythe was actually dissuaded by some leading Puritan clergymen within the church from leaving the church himself. But then, between the summer of 1606 and the Easter in 1607, we reached the crucial point at which Smythe actually felt that he had to become a separatist. And the reason for that, I think, was really simply this. And it's all, to some extent, to do with geography. Now, Smythe had been operating primarily in Lincolnshire. Lincoln was where he was town preacher. Gainsborough, also in Lincolnshire, was where he had made his home and where, of course, he had preached illegally. Just to the west was Nottinghamshire, and the division between the two was the River Trent. Now, an important point was this, that the River Trent was also the dividing line between the north and the south of England. On the left-hand side of the map, which is actually north of the Trent, is Nottinghamshire. That was within the Archdiocese of York. On the east side of the river, Lincolnshire was within the Diocese of Canterbury. Now, the Bancroft Canons had come into force in Lincolnshire, in the Diocese of Lincoln, at the end of 1604. They didn't come into force in the Diocese of York, for a number of technical reasons, until the middle of 1606. And in fact, they didn't come into force actually in practice for another year after that, because the Archbishop of York had recently died. He died early in 1606, and a new man had to be appointed. And the new man, called Toby Matthew, would not arrive until the middle of 1607. So for a period between 1606 and 1607, there was unusual degree of religious freedom actually in Nottinghamshire, because the Bancroft Canons had not yet come into effect. And so Smythe was able to come over to Lincolnshire and continue his activities, continue preaching, which he did. He continued to preach in churches in Nottinghamshire. And at this point, he became a close friend of Thomas Helwys. The crucial events that led Smythe to become a separatist were really these. First of all, the looming threat that the Bancroft Canons were going to come into effect in the north of England, in the Archdiocese of York, as well as the south of England, in the Archdiocese of Canterbury. That was the first problem. First issue. The second decisive factor was the new friendship he formed with Thomas Helwys, which we'll be discussing tomorrow. Essentially, Thomas Helwys, himself a minor landowning gentleman, not a terribly rich man, that's something we'll talk about tomorrow, not a terribly rich man, minor landowning gentleman, was part of a part of the Puritan network in the region, and he became very close to John Smythe. And Thomas Helwys effectively provided John Smythe with a place of shelter. The third decisive factor was the return to the Nottinghamshire area of John Robinson. Now, I referred to John Robinson earlier on. John Robinson was someone whom Smythe had probably almost certainly met when they were at Cambridge. Robinson was certainly close to the man we mentioned earlier, Thomas Newhouse, another friend of John Smythe. Robinson himself had also been deprived of his livelihood. He had lost his position as a town preacher in Norwich, or assistant town preacher. He also had been unable to find any living within the church. I mean, he was also a man in search of a livelihood, and a man who had a very similar career trajectory to John Smythe. And Robinson returned to his home village of Sturton-le-Steeple in Nottinghamshire early in 1607. So the two men came together. The fourth decisive factor, was the impending arrival of a new Archbishop of York in 1607. Toby Matthew was a man who was particularly conscientious in the stamping out of nonconformity of any form. He was similar to Richard Bancroft in that respect. His primary mission was to stamp out Roman Catholicism in the north of England. That was his primary mission, not least because, of course, this was the period after the Gunpowder Plot of 1605, in which James I had become, and rightly so, newly alarmed about the threat from the Catholic fifth column. So that was Toby Matthew's principal responsibility. However, although he was primarily concerned with action against Roman Catholics, it was pretty clear that he was also going to enforce the Bancroft Canons in the north of England as firm as he possibly could. A further issue was the fact that this was a particularly stressed and difficult period in English social and economic history. The years around 1605, 1607 were years when the standard of living of the labouring poor in England reached pretty much a low point, the lowest point it had probably done for 100 years or so. And this led to a series of agrarian disturbances known as the Midland Rising of 1607 at exactly this point. Now, this is not directly related to the activities of men like Smythe. It's not entirely clear what they thought about the Midland Rising, but there's no question from the various evidence that survives that it meant that the authorities became increasingly alarmed about any science edition anywhere in the locality. And finally, there was something which I'll refer to more tomorrow, which was the case of a man called Nicholas Fuller of Gray's Inn. This is something I'll discuss tomorrow because it's a little bit complicated and I don't think I have time for it this evening. All these things came together in the course of 1607. And it was at this point, only at this point, after this very long period of preparation, everything fell into place. What had happened was that the Bancroft canons had effectively made the famous Elizabethan New Poor Law of the late 1590s. And this also affected the nature of the parish because it meant the parish became far more important as an entity of civil government. In future, anybody who was indigent, anybody who was poor, the destitute, had to be supported by the parish. That was a legal responsibility, which meant that parishes had to raise poor rates, they had to appoint parish constables, they had to appoint new overseers of the poor. The parish was being reinvented at this period as a more effective and efficient unit of government, at precisely the time that Bancroft was trying to turn it into a much more effective system of local religious control, which, by the way, he did actually pretty successfully for quite a period. And some of Bancroft's canons actually remained in force until 1969, believe it or not. They were the canons that affected members of the clergy, but even the canons that affected members of the laity remained in force after their suspension during the Civil War period until the middle of the 18th century. For men like Robinson and Smythe, all of this created an insoluble dilemma. Here were men who in the 1580s and 90s had been schooled and educated in a form of Puritan evangelical faith which placed an enormous amount of emphasis on the integrity of the individual soul in pursuit of salvation, whatever the cost. It was also a form of belief which had placed a huge amount of emphasis on getting to the right form of worship, particularly the right form of prayer, a form of prayer that, if you like, represented and embodied the fervent utterance of the soul in pursuit of salvation. They had now reached a point by 1607, 1608, where it had become crystal clear to them that the Anglican parish as it existed in their area, and as Bancroft had reinvented it, was simply a place where they could not survive. And that really was what led to their departure from the Church of England in the early part of 1607. It probably happened in the spring of 1607, and in John Smythe's case for a very good and simple reason, which is this, that in 1607, John Smythe made his last attempt, a successful attempt as it happens, to preach in a parish church. Early in 1607, he preached a sermon at a church at a place called Basford near Nottingham. Nottingham, about 40 miles from Lincoln, 40 miles west of Lincoln. The importance of Basford, or it was the home of Thomas Helvete. And early in 1607, the vicar of Basford allowed John Smythe to preach a sermon in his parish church. Now, of course, this was completely illegal. No license, totally against the rules, and of course, because the Bancroft canons now applied in the Archdiocese of York as well as Canterbury, the church wardens of the village, of the parish, were obliged to report him to the authorities, and that's what they did. And so February the 28th, 1607, the vicar of Basford, who would allow John Smythe to preach in the parish church, became the object of prosecution by the authorities in the Archdeaconry of Nottingham. And that was a decisive moment, because at that point it was clear that Smythe could no longer preach in the Diocese of Lincoln, obviously. He couldn't work as a physician. He couldn't work as a school teacher. He couldn't preach in Nottinghamshire. He couldn't preach anywhere. And also the Bancroft canons had made private worship illegal. It became illegal after that day to hold private acts of worship in a gentleman's house. So that was out too. And that was the point, therefore, at which it all began, at which the act of separation occurs. And it was there, probably almost certainly at Easter 1607, that Smythe set up his official congregation in complete separation from the Church of England. Now, he had probably already been running a local religious community in Gainsborough and also across the river in Nottinghamshire. But this was the moment at which, in addition to setting up a congregation, he specifically and completely severed his connection with the official church as well. And so that was it. And in conclusion, so I'm just as I come to a close, this was basically the process. These were the phases which led to his separation and his exile. The sad thing about all this, of course, is in a sense it was all totally unnecessary for the following reason. In fact, Bancroft had already won his campaign against nonconformity long before this date. In the spring of 1605, Bancroft and James I had effectively expelled already from the Church of England almost every single nonconforming clergyman. There are only about 70 or 80, because in fact nonconformity in the Church of England, although it was extensive, it was limited. In other words, there were nonconforming clergymen in large parts of the country, but they tended to be concentrated in specific locations. If you drew a map, you would see a number of England showing element of nonconformity. You would see a scattering of points across the map, but with concentration in one or two areas. All of these effectively had been removed already during 1605. In Lincolnshire, the nonconforming clergy had effectively been disciplined by the bishop eventually. In most parts of the northern province, in the Diocese of York, there was little Protestant nonconformity anyway by this stage. It had all gone. So in effect what Bancroft did was to perpetrate an enormous exercise in overkill, but which nevertheless led to the departure of John Smythe and John Robinson. They separated from the church, and the following year, 1608, they went into exile in the Netherlands, which is what I'll discuss in more detail tomorrow. So that's my conclusion. That was really what had led to John Smythe's departure. As I say, it's a rather sad story because in many ways it was unnecessary. The church had already won the victory that it had aimed for. What effectively happened, in fact, as a result of incidents like this, what they actually did, of course, was they produced a far more decisively, a far stronger, more resilient separatist movement in England, albeit one which was led from exiles, whether in the Netherlands or in New England, which in due course during the English Civil War became a huge movement, by which time it has ceased to be known as separatism and become known as independency, which actually became, of course, under Oliver Cromwell, in effect, the governing regime of the kingdom as a whole. That was the unintended consequence of what Richard Bancroft had done. And with that, I'll bring my lecture to a close, and I'll take any questions.